So let me start by giving you a little bit of background on the topic of my presentation. I think it's fair to say that there's a growing concern over the negative impact of misinformation on the democratic process. I think it's fair to say that we can find traces of that concern both within philosophy and also outside philosophy, just in the media. So let me just give two examples of what I have in mind when I'm thinking of a growing concern within philosophy. So in 2017, a researcher called Neil Levy published an article titled "The Bad News About Fake News," in which he basically argued that misinformation is effective, that it has the power to kind of influence the belief formation process of democratic citizens. And I think that closer to you, Regina Rini, who's now working at York University, I think that a part of her work, at least, should be conceived of as focusing on the relationship between social media and democracy. So I think that this concern generally gives rise to a debate about how liberal democracies should tackle the problem posed by misinformation and, more precisely, fake news. And I think that there's so far been kind of three categories of remedies against misinformation that have been proposed. So the first category include what I call change in individual cognitive habits. So some people argue that social media users kind of bear the responsibility of developing cognitive habits that are going to lead them to be immune from the bad information, the information of poor quality to which they may be exposed. Some virtue epistemologists, if you're interested, for instance, in virtue epistemology, have argued that social media users should develop kind of intellectual virtues that will protect them against misinformation, even that we should teach such virtues to university students. Now, the second category of remedies include focus on what I call algorithmic design. I think that it's fair to say that it's generally the kind of remedy that is privileged by social networks themselves. So if you ask Facebook, basically, what should we do about misinformation? They're probably going to respond something like, we're on it. We have the right people. We have a team of people working on that. We're going to develop algorithm that's going to minimize the likelihood that our users are going to be exposed to bad information. And I think that the third kind of broad category of remedies against misinformation include what I call legal prohibitions. And generally, legal prohibitions tend to be enacted by Western liberal democracies that are not so convinced that, let's say, kind of the inner innovation of social networks is going to be sufficient to remedy the problem, that maybe we need to kind of provide social network with a strong incentive to take the problem of fake news seriously. And let me say a little bit more about what kind of legal prohibitions I have in mind. So some of you may be aware that last year, very recently actually, last fall, the Macron government in France enacted a law against fake news that is named the Loi contre la manipulation de l'information. So this law has been adopted by the Assemblée nationale, so the legislative chamber in France, very recently on November 20th, 2018. It was in fact ratified by the Constitutional Council. That's kind of the last step on December 20th. And I don't want to dig too deep into kind of the specific features of this law, but what I want to do is to draw your attention to its main features. So this law basically works by empowering French judges to order removal of fake news from websites, including social media, within 48 hours. Now, the legislative process surrounding the enactment of that law has been extremely controversial. I mean, the enactment of the law has been extremely controversial. One kind of important sign of this is that the French Senate has refused to ratify the law, and it has refused to ratify the law partly because it considers that this law is incompatible with our freedom to communicate. So basically, the objection is that the Macron law that is now has now been implemented threatens our individual right to freedom of expression. So I think that this this creates a kind of normative question, a traditional normative question, interesting for political theorists or political philosophers. And I think that this question is the following: should liberal democratic states coerce social media into removing fake news from their platform? And what I want to do today is quite simply to kind of contribute to the reflection on this question by doing three things, essentially. So first, I want to build an argument in favor of the legal prohibition of fake news. I think that as soon as a government proposes to restrict a kind of speech, it's always good for philosophers or political theorists to wonder, why should we enact this law? What do we lose if we don't? What do we gain if we do? So I'm going to do that in the first part of the presentation by drawing insights from social epistemology. And then in the second part of the presentation, I want to consider what I consider to be the central objection, or at least a very strong objection, an important objection against the legal prohibition of fake news. And then finally, in the third part of the presentation, I'd like to sketch a response to this objection by considering the relationship between expression or speech and autonomy. All right, so let me start with the first part of the presentation, with the part of the presentation in which I build an argument in favor of the legal prohibition of fake news. But before I kind of present the main steps of the argument that I intend to build, I think that it's important to kind of specify what I mean by fake news. It's a slippery concept, so I'd like to kind of specify what's the definition on which I rely in this paper. It's not a definition that I've come up with. I think that philosophers have been working on the concept of fake news in the last 2 years and have done like fairly good work. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to borrow a definition that I quite like that's been proposed last year by a social epistemologist called Axel Gelfert, who's working in Berlin, in a 2018 paper simply titled Fake News, a Definition. Sorry, there's a glitch on this slide. I've double-checked the slides before the Skype call, and there shouldn't be any more glitch on the rest of the PowerPoint presentation. So Gelfert defines fake news as the deliberate presentation of false or misleading claims as news, where the claims are misleading by design. And then he goes on to kind of clarify what he means by this expression, by design, by arguing that fake news either aims to instill falsehoods in its target audience. For example, in order to discredit a political opponent. I think that to give a few examples, we can think of the kind of fake news article that you have probably encountered during the 2016 American presidential election. So Pizzagate, for instance, fake news that are trying to, let's say, modify inside the public to form false beliefs about specific political candidate, hoping that these false beliefs are going to modify themselves, the behavior of members of the citizenry. So that's kind of one kind of fake news, politically motivated. But Gelfert also underlines that content can be considered as fake news, also because the way it is deliberately operated is objectively likely to mislead its target audience, its real goal being, for example, the generation of clickbait through sensational claims that attract an online audience. So I think that those two categories of fake news are kind of the main categories of fake news. Those are the ones at least that I have in mind when writing this paper. So politically motivated ones and ones that are basically inciting the public just to click on a link, the goal being a commercial. And it's important that to specify that in order to qualify a fake news, then the articles to which someone is trying to direct internet traffic contains some false misleading claims. And another thing I want to stress is that according to Gelfert's definition, at least, this whole process is deliberate. So there's an intentionality requirement. So I think this is a fairly good definition of fake news. I have a slight worry about it. Gelfert seems quite confident that political satire, so articles that you find on websites like The Onion, are not gonna be included by this definition. I'm not so convinced that it won't. I'm happy to go back to this question during the Q&A, but just know, for the sake of the discussion, that the kind of main legal prohibition against misinformation that I have in mind when presenting and writing this article is the French one, and the French one contains an explicit clause that excludes political satire. Okay, so that's for the kind of conceptual clarification of a term on which I'm going to rely quite frequently today, fake news. Now, let me present the argument proper. So the argument starts by consideration about what I call mutual epistemic dependence. This has been a fairly important theme in social epistemology in the last decade. So the basic idea is that individuals have a basic interest in relying on each other's testimony to gain knowledge that allows them to fulfill their individual needs and aspirations. So if you think about it, most of the knowledge that we possess has been acquired through testimony. It's not just that we need testimony to kind of construct a theoretical understanding of the way the world is. It's also that we constantly rely on our conception of how the world is to act. So we rely on testimony basically to decide how we're going to behave in order to fulfill the different goals that we set for ourselves. So I think that there are many quotes in the literature that kind of illustrate this idea. One that I quite like is a quote by Shauna Schifrin in a 2014 book called Speech Matters. So Schifrin writes, "Given our mutual epistemic limitations and the complexity of the environment in which we find ourselves, we depend upon one another's beliefs, knowledge, and reactions to our beliefs to construct a reliable picture of our world so that we can navigate through it and understand who we are and where we are situated." So that's kind of the basis of the argument, but from there I moved to a consideration about the role of expert, and more precisely of expert testimony, in what I've called mutual epistemic dependence. And that's also been a very important theme of social epistemology during the last decade. So I think that experts play a central role in epistemic dependence. I think that the existence of sincere and reliable expert relieves us from a substantial epistemic burden. And more precisely, I think we can say that experts provide us with information that we're rationally warranted in not acquiring or verifying ourselves. So just to give an example of that, the whole point of kind of having physicians, doctors, is that by going to see a doctor that has the knowledge necessary to kind of diagnose the condition from which you may suffer, you kind of relieve yourself from having to diagnose your own condition. That would be kind of time-consuming and costly because you would have to acquire the expertise necessary to do that reliably. And then, of course, if you kind of doubt a diagnostic, you can decide to go see another physician and ask him or her for his or her opinion, but this, of course, doesn't really count as escaping mutual epistemic dependency. It's just another way of relying on testimony. So in a nutshell, if I had to express this thought, I would say that experts contribute to what we can call the social division of epistemic labor. So again, this is those are kind of the fundamental considerations behind the argument. But now, of course, eventually I moved to considerations that more directly concern the relationship between journalism and fake news. So I think that we're engaged in a mutually beneficial form of epistemic dependence, not just with experts generally, but also with journalists. I think that it's fair to say that journalists provide us with reliable information, usually reliable information about the world. Occasional errors are part of the process, but generally. And I think that having access to this information facilitates the pursuit of our individual interests. So I think that the kind of most obvious example of this would be political interests. So we, of course, want to know what political parties propose as political measures in order to kind of make up our mind to decide for which party we're going to vote. We also want to know what the current government is doing to decide, for instance, if we should protest protest certain measures that the current government is proposing, and we very often rely on journalists to provide us with this information. Now, if these claims are plausible, what's the wrong in fake news on my account, or at least a wrong in fake news? In the later part of the presentation, I'm going to consider a different kind of wrong. But I think one wrong in fake news is that originators of fake news knowingly undermine the expertise of journalists, so they give us reason to stop relying on the expertise of journalists, or at least to accept the epistemic burden of verifying the truth value of their claims. So the thought here is that if you're a social media user that uses Facebook daily, and then you learn that a lot of the information to which you are exposed on Facebook is unreliable, then you kind of have reasons to not take the information to which you're exposed at face value. And you also have reasons to maybe do more research to kind of accept an epistemic burden of doing research to verify, to inquire into the true value of these claims. So how do originators of fake news manage to do that, to kind of impose on us this epistemic burden? I think that they do so by faking the expertise of journalists. It's kind of one dimension, or let's say one element of my framework is that I'm reluctant to just portray originators of fake news as liars. They're often just portrayed as liars. I think that the kind of lie in which originators of fake news are the kind of lies in which they engage is a bit more specific. So I think that diffusing fake news can generally be conceived as a kind of intellectual imposture. So someone who creates fake news, deliberately create fake news and deliberately diffuse fake news is pretending that he or she or an organization it is trying to kind of fulfill. It's pretending that it's trying to fulfill the kind of traditional function of journalism, but the truth is that the whole time, all along, they have no real intention of doing so. The intention that they have is to foster their political or commercial goals through deceptive means. And I think that if this is plausible, then we can say that originators of fake news show disregard for our basic interest in engaging in a mutually beneficial form of epistemic dependence with journalists, and that the prohibition of deceitful fake news protects our basic interest in engaging in this mutually beneficial form of epistemic dependence against this form of disregard. So that's kind of the main thrust of the argument that I'm trying to build. But as I've mentioned, I think that there are different kinds of objections that can be directed against this argument. I'm not going to try to anticipate all the objections you might have. I think that's kind of the function of Q&As. But one objection that I consider to be especially important is what I call the free speech objection. So basically, in the rest of the presentation, what I'm going to try to do is to present this objection as I conceive of it, and then sketch a response to it. So what's the free speech objections against legal prohibitions against misinformation and fake news? Well, as I conceive of it, the objection goes like this. So even if legal prohibitions create desirable social results, even if it's true to claim, as I've just did, that they may allow us to kind of safeguard the social division of epistemic labor, they're still incompatible with our individual rights, and more specifically with our individual right to free speech. So I conceive of this objection as a deontological objection to kind of consequentialist forms of reasoning. So the idea here is that the protection of individuals' rights trumps the promotion of society's epistemic welfare. In fact, that the protection of individual rights trumps the promotion of society's welfare, period. So one philosopher that I think expresses this thought quite nicely, it's the first time I quote Scanlon in this presentation. It's not going to be the last one. I think he's an important thinker to engage with when one is interested in freedom of expression. So Scanlon writes in a 1978 article titled, freedom of speech and categories of expression. Rights appear to be something we can reason about, and this reasoning process does not appear to be merely a calculation of consequences. So the idea basically is that, you know, even if we manage to promote society's epistemic welfare, it's possible that individuals have something like a trump card against the kind of measures that I'm considering today. And that because such measures would infringe on their individual rights, then we should not enact them. So that's the objection as I conceive of it, but I want to say a bit more about the objection. I think that the objection is motivated by considering the interest of two kinds of individuals. So I think first, the objection is motivated by consideration of the interests of speakers. I think that the thought behind the objection is that individuals who wittingly or unwittingly diffuse fake news are pursuing legitimate interests. So, of course, I mention wittingly or unwittingly because, I mean, you know this, but I'm going to clarify it anyway. The way a fake news article usually spread in social media is that it's going to be designed by people who are conscious of what they're doing or kind of deliberately you know, deceiving the public either for political or commercial means. But of course, a fake news article is going to spread better if people just believe its content and kind of unintentionally share it. I mean, intentionally share it, but share it without knowing that the claims that it contains are false or misleading. So I think that that's one kind of consideration that motivate the objection. What kind of interest of speakers precisely? I can think of two. I think that speakers have a legitimate interest in self-expression. Individuals have an interest in sharing their understanding of themselves and of the world. And I also think, and we don't speak about that as often, but I do think that it's important in social media. I think that speakers have a legitimate interest in freely associating with others, and that promoting specific content in social media facilitates this. It facilitates association with like-minded individuals. So by sharing a specific kind of content, you're kind of defining your identity in social media, and then the people who share your worldview can decide to associate with you. So that's one kind of interest that I think, a consideration of one kind of interest that are behind the objection. But another kind of interest that I think motivate the objection is a consideration for the interests of audiences. And I'm actually going to spend a lot of time discussing this today, because it's been quite important in the philosophical literature that focuses on free speech. So I think the thought is the following: democratic citizens have a fundamental interest in being treated as autonomous agents by their government. It's the first time that I mentioned autonomy in the content of the presentation. Again, it's not going to be the last time. I think that the thought related to this is the thought that laws that aim to protect the mental environment of citizens against deceptive speech or other kinds of speech, for instance, hate speech, a lot of philosophical literature has focused on hate speech. Such kind of prohibitions, restrictions of speech do not meet this autonomy requirement, for they imply that citizens are kind of unable to decide what to believe by relying on their own cognitive resources. I.e. that audiences are not composed of what we can call autonomous rational agents. Here's one philosopher, as I mentioned, Scanlon, that I can associate with these kinds of consideration. It's interesting because there's not a lot of literature right now, of course, I mean, there's a growing body of literature on fake news, but there's not a lot of literature on the relationship between free speech and fake news as a kind of deceptive speech. So what I'm trying to do here is kind of dig in a kind of very important contribution to the philosophical literature on free speech and kind of apply it to the case of misinformation by kind of imagining what, given what these philosophers wrote, what they would probably claim with regards to the French proposition. So Scanlon wrote in early article on freedom of expression that he published in 1971, there are certain harms which, although they would not occur but for certain acts of expression, nonetheless cannot be taken as part of a justification for legal restriction on these acts. And these harms are A, harms to certain individuals which consist in their coming to have false beliefs, as a result of those acts of expression. And then bear with me for the second part of the quote, please. These harms are also harmful consequences of acts performed as a result of those acts of expression, where the connection between the acts of expression and the subsequent harmful acts consists merely in the fact that the act of expression led the agents to believe. I think that extrapolating kind of from these considerations, there's a reason to believe that Scanlon would be skeptical with regards to legal prohibitions against misinformation, because I think that such prohibitions are largely motivated by the worry that misinformation is going to lead the citizenry to form false beliefs. And here Scanlon is telling us this kind of worry, this worry that part of the citizenry is going to come to hold false belief is not sufficient to motivate a law, a legal restriction on free speech more precisely. So goes what I call the free speech objection. As you're probably realizing right now, I'm kind of building myself against the argument that I've presented in the first part. And what I want to do in the rest of the presentation, in the third part of the presentation, is to sketch a response quite simply to this argument. So let's move to part 3, expression and autonomy, responding to the free speech objection. How can we kind of philosophically respond to this objection that I've just considered? I want to start by noting that there's kind of a philosophical tendency, sorry, I have a tendency to speak too quickly. There's kind of a philosophical tendency to consider that the fewer restrictions over speech there are, then the more autonomous citizens are. And I think that this is based on a mistaken assumption that having been exposed to a certain kind of speech, an audience is always free to decide how to react. That is what belief to form and what attitude to adopt. And I think that this is a little simple. I'm inclined to think that it's overly simplistic, and that having access to more speech does not necessarily make one more autonomous, and that some forms of speech effectively undermine autonomy. So that's the kind of the claim that I'm going to try to motivate in argue for in the last part of the presentation. And I think that in order to do so, well, it would be a good idea to kind of specify what I mean by autonomy, because one feature of the concept of autonomy is that it's quite important and present in philosophical discussion. But another feature of the concept of autonomy is it's quite slippery, and that different authors use it in very different ways. So what I'm going to try to do in this third part of the presentation is not to construct an exhaustive theory of autonomy that would list all of the necessary and sufficient conditions that must be met in order for us to consider that an agent is autonomous. But I do want to claim that autonomy includes the following. So I think that autonomy includes or should be conceived of as rational self-government. So borrowing a quote from John Chrisman, I think we can say that that autonomy is the capacity to be one's own person, to live one's life according to reasons and motives that are taken as one's own and not the product of manipulative or distorting external forces. And another thing that I want to claim is that autonomy includes a reason-responsive requirement. Sorry, that's a typo on that slide. The typo is also on the handout. It should read as reason-responsive requirement. I think that an autonomous agent is in a position to appreciate the reasons that she has to do certain things, considering the goals she freely sets for herself. So let me stress that I know that this is kind of a technical slide, and it's always good to illustrate technical considerations with examples. So here's an example that's meant to do that I call Sarah and the Green Party. So let us say that in country X, the Green Party proposes regulations that would be the most efficient to protect the environment, and that there's kind of an expert consensus on that. So if Sarah strongly desires to vote for the party that will most efficiently protect the environment, I think that she has a reason to vote for the Green Party. And I also think that forms of speech that make it more difficult for her to appreciate this reason, as well as other reasons that she has given the goals that she freely sets for herself, decrease her level of autonomy. So you probably see me coming. The next consideration in this response is that as an instance of misinformation, I think that fake news can be conceived of as a form of speech that decreases personal autonomy. How does it do so? How does it do so? I think it does so by interfering with our capacity to appreciate reasons. And we could even say that they create fake reasons. So here's another example. If you want to protect your children's health, but you've unfortunately been led to believe that vaccines are dangerous or contagious because you've encountered online a fake news article that implied that they were, I think that you may take yourself to have a reason to not have your children vaccinated, but there's, in a sense at least, you have reasons to actually have your children vaccinated, even if you don't perceive that reason, or at least what some philosophers would call an external reason to do so. Okay, the next slide is a little bit of a digression, so I'm not going to dig too deep into this. This is not a paper in which I dig too deep into what I call the empirics of fake news or the cognitive science of fake news. I'm actually eager to know if you think that I should. I've done so in the past. I've got an article coming up in which I engage in a kind of analysis of empirical findings that are relevant. So I'm going to kind of close this parenthesis, but just signal that if you want to discuss kind of the empirics, what reasons do we actually have that fake news work? And when I say work, that they influence the belief formation process, I'm happy to kind of come back during to this question during the Q&A. But going back to the response I'm trying to sketch to the free speech objection, I think that some of you may be thinking, okay, that's an interesting story, a kind of an interesting account of autonomy on which you're relying, but what was actually your reasons to accept your conception of autonomy? There are many kind of theories of autonomy available in the philosophical literature on personal autonomy. And I kind of want to stress that I think one advantage of accepting at least some of the ideas that I've expressed so far is that they not only help us make sense of the rationale behind some new laws that our governments or like democratic citizens may decide to implement, like it has been happening in France last fall. But these considerations also kind of help us make sense of some laws that have been enacted and have been in vigor for a long time, even in countries which certainly, like the United States, cannot be accused in being overly restrictive when it comes to free speech. So some of you may be aware that the US Federal Trade Commission enforces truth in advertising laws, according to which all advertisements must be truthful, not misleading, and when appropriate, backed by scientific evidence. And I think it's interesting to wonder why. Why do we have, or do Americans have laws like this? And one element of answer I want to give is that, like fake news, false advertising, conceived as a different kind of deceptive speech, kind of hinders our capacity to appreciate the reasons we have to purchase or not to purchase a good of our service. And I think that by doing so, false advertising also decreases our autonomy. So the kind of motivation behind this slide is the following. So what I'm trying to claim is you may be inclined to think that legal prohibitions against fake news are incompatible with free speech. Some philosophers may be inclined to think that, but actually, if you are inclined to believe that false advertising laws are legitimate, then I think that by analogy, you kind of have a reason to accept different kinds of prohibitions against, or prohibitions against, to be more precise, different kinds of deceptive speech. It's just really interesting to note that I've given you a quote by Scanlon earlier from an article, a 1971 article titled "A Theory of Freedom of Expression." In a later article, in the 1978 article, Scanlon basically dropped and criticizes earlier framework, and one case he considers and motivates him to kind of drop the earlier framework is false advertising laws. He's inclined to think they're legitimate, but he's inclined to think that they are incompatible with his earlier framework. I think it's just kind of interesting to have laws against false advertising in mind when we consider recent attempts to legislate against fake news. Now, I've mentioned that in fact, a lot of what I said in the last 35 minutes or so focus on what I've called the interests of audience. So my focus has been the kind of effects of misinformation on the autonomy of audiences. But when I presented the free speech objection, I've mentioned that I think this objection, I think a fair kind of reconstruction of this objection should be conceived as being motivated by concern for two different kinds of interest. And I've also mentioned that, that it was motivated by an interest, a concern over the interest of speakers. And I've not said a lot about that, so I'd like to say at least a little bit. So I think that it's fair. It's important to recognize that legal prohibitions against fake news do affect the autonomy of speakers, including those who unwittingly share fake news online. So imagine that the French law is in effect, it's working well, let us say, and one morning you wake up, you log in your Facebook account, and you find out that one article you shared yesterday or the day before has just been removed from your newsfeed. In fact, it's been removed from the entire platform because a French judge coerced Facebook into doing so. Then you may be angry. You may claim, well, I was trying to kind of share an article. This article relates to my worldview. I was trying to express myself. I genuinely believe the claims contained in this article. I've done nothing wrong, and this kind of law unfairly penalizes me. And I think it's important to recognize this objection. I think it's an interesting objection. I think that one response we could give to such social media users is that social media platforms provide them with alternative ways of expressing their point of view. So for instance, nothing would stop such a user from writing a post, expressing anger, expressing disagreement with the law, and also kind of mentioning the claims, mentioning again the claims that were contained in the fake news article. And I think that saying this helps us see that prohibitions against fake news are not prohibitions of specific content. They are prohibitions of a certain technique of expression, which is basically sharing articles that have been conceived of by people that only pretended to inform the public when their intention lied elsewhere. I think that, as I've mentioned, the main question that interests me within the confine of this article, at least of this paper, should liberal democratic states coerce social media into removing fake news from their platform? I've suggested that they have reasons to do so by considering the importance of testimony for the pursuit of our individual interests, and a phenomenon that I've called mutual epistemic dependence. I think that philosophers who endorse the autonomy defense of free speech, there's different kinds of defense of free speech, and I've really focused today on the autonomy defense of free speech, which is a defense that I take to be very influential, to be fair. I think that philosophers who endorse the autonomy defense of free speech have reasons to accept legal regulations against deceptive speech. But I want to end by stressing that I don't think that this paper alone, or the consideration that this presentation contains, allow us to kind of give a decisive, definitive answer to the question, should liberal democratic states coerce social media into removing fake news from their platform? The reason why I don't think that I'm right now in a position to give a decisive answer is that there may be different kinds of reasons against legal prohibitions that I do not consider in this article, at least. So let me give you two kinds of reasons that can play against legal prohibitions that I think are interesting to discuss also. So the first would be claims that such laws are redundant. So this has been claimed in France because there's a law from the 19th century that kind of already prohibits expressing or just prohibits false speech in public spaces. So some people have claimed, why is the Macron government doing that? We already have a law. It's just kind of trying to, you know, make political capital. We don't really need this law. And I think even more interesting for let's say, scholars is considerations that are related to efficiency. So it may turn out that this law, which has just been enacted kind of last fall, does not do a very good job at achieving its intended results. Sorry, it may turn out that judges are not very good at identifying fake news article. It may turn out that they take too long to order the removal of specific content, and by the time that the social media kind of remove the content, then it already spread and already influenced the belief formation process. I'm fairly open to considering such reasons. But what I take my work in this article, not generally, I have like kind of a broader project on misinformation, but in this paper, I think that I take my work to be kind of clarifying the reasons that we may have in favor or against such prohibitions. And I think if the conclusion that we reach at the end is we're going to reject such prohibitions because they don't work very well, well, it's still interesting to know, or at least to suggest that you know, the reasons we have to reject such prohibitions are not free speech related. So I think that this conclusion is kind of controversial enough to motivate, I don't know if you'll agree, to kind of motivate a philosophical paper. So I've been speaking with for about 45 minutes. I'll stop here. That was my objective. I didn't mention it, so that we have time for discussion. So let me just thank you for taking the time to attend. I very much look forward to discussion, your questions, and having your input. So thanks.